This episode is brought to you by the new true crime docuseries American Nightmare, only on Netflix. In 2015, the Vallejo, California Police Department received a strange phone call about a kidnapping. But when the truth is stranger than fiction, you won't know who to trust or what is real. A fast-paced true crime thriller with cliffhangers at every turn. Watch American Nightmare now, only on Netflix.
He would sign $1 million loans. He hung out with Trump and Marla Maples.
He looked like himself with a lot of burn damage.
They said it looks like a possible pipe bomb.
I think everybody's first gut reaction was, oh, this looks like a mob hit. So we get the recordings and we start listening to them, and they're talking about the murder.
You're listening to True Crime Arizona, the podcast.
The year was 1996. To put it simply, life was good.
We've been out on boats in San Diego, and I remember a July 4th party he had up on Whale Watcher Way in La Jolla, and he rented the top of the hill, the house at the top of the hill. He'd rented for the whole summer, him and Pam, and would have tremendous parties, fun.
That lavish lifestyle, it was something Ron Lehman remembers well. Those invites and memories with well-known businessman Gary Triano. Ron was Gary's attorney and good friend in Tucson, Arizona.
What was your relation to Gary?
Gary and I spent a lot of quality moments together as his attorney for several years, probably 6 years or so, through some intense times shortly after the real estate market crashed. Well, I think one of the first things I did for him was a pretty major case involving a $3 or $4 million personal guarantee on the loan. It's our anniversary dinner, and a bottle of Dom Perignon would come over to the table, compliments of Gary, and so, you know, like any other, you know, business, when you spend time in the trenches with the client, you enjoy your downtime together.
Gary was at all the major events with all the biggest names, often out golfing with them too.
Gary was always on business. He always had an eye out for business. He would go golfing with his banker, and they would he would sign $1 million loans and not read the documents.
But they were friends with Donald Trump.
Yeah, they hung out. Yeah, I mean, he hung out with Trump and Marla Maples during that period.
He was social, a big socialite.
He was social, and he also believed in projecting an image of being very successful. As a matter of fact, Gary brought Donald Trump to McHale Center. You know, here in Tucson, we love our University of Arizona Wildcats, and Gary and I were both fans. Gary had some nice seats.
But so often, things aren't really as they seem. What appeared to be a life full of success, riches, and pure joy was flawed. Maybe nobody would have known his true financial status if it wasn't for taking a deeper look. Looking for a reason, Gary Triano would be assassinated.
It is strange that 2 of the last 3 calls he made from the golf course on the day that he died were made to me.
Why do you think that was?
You know, I don't know what it was about, but I knew something was up because Gary was a cool customer, okay? And Gary knew me, and he knew that if he called me and I was at lunch, he knew I would be calling him from my car to find out what was up. Unless I was in court or something like that, I would return his calls pretty quick. And he called me twice and left 2 messages, which was in 6-7 years that I knew Gary, I cannot ever remember a time where he would call me a second time.
What did he say in those messages?
Call me, you know, I need to talk to you, something's up. There was nothing necessarily significant. Just wanted to talk to me. To this day, I have no idea what it was about.
This is daytime on a Friday afternoon.
November 1st, 1996. A beautiful weekend of weather ahead in Tucson. the perfect conditions for a round of golf at the La Paloma Country Club.
I actually lived about 2 minutes away from the club, so it was very convenient for me, and I was very happy to be a member there because it literally meant I could just go there whenever I wanted.
Sam Buttman was a cardiologist at the University Medical Center in Tucson. He thought, why not go golfing on Saturday at the club?
So it was a Friday, and I was going there from work or from home. There was generally a sign-up sheet to play golf on Saturday, and I wanted to see what was going on. So there was a piece of paper on a bulletin board just outside on the wall before you actually went into the clubhouse.
He was one of the only people outside near the parking lot.
I'm looking at the sign-up sheet, and I hear this huge explosion, a bang.
911, what is the emergency?
La Paloma Country Club. Bomb just blew up in a car.
First, you don't know it's an explosion, just a loud sound.
Okay.
Parking lot.
Okay, sir, just 1 moment.
So I immediately sort of run or walk fast 10 feet maybe to see around the corner.
This is the sheriff's office. Do you know if anyone was in the car?
I do not know.
And what I see is there's a lady standing next to what I think was a Jeep Cherokee.
All right, we're on our way right now. Tell everybody to stay away from the vehicle if it's still on fire.
And she looked shocked. The windows were blown out.
We have an explosion in the country club parking lot.
Okay, I need to know, is somebody in?
And I see a car with flames coming out of it with a hood that's missing, and there's someone in the car.
We might have somebody, a dead body.
Sam rushes to the car to check whoever is inside.
It looked like a war scene around the car. So I quickly checked.
So you were the first one to see him.
Is it on fire?
Yeah, I was actually, by chance.
What did he look like? Was he intact?
From what I could see, he was intact. I looked at his head and torso.
One of the victims has no pulse. They begun CPR.
He was very pale. The striking thing, I've seen people die, and for various reasons, obviously, I'm a physician, but it's just white. And it took me a while to understand why he looked white.
Somebody supposedly was blown up in the car.
Why he looked like all the blood literally had drained out of him, because all the blood had literally drained out of him.
The man, he looks like he's dead. His name is Gary Triano.
The explosion wasn't a car malfunction or overheated engine. It was a bomb that was sitting in the passenger seat of his car.
As I was at home doing dishes after dinner, and my phone rang, and my sergeant said he needed me to respond to the scene of a car bombing that involved a fatality. My first reaction before I even got to the scene was I told my sergeant, I said, I'm not responding up there until the bomb squad tells me it's a safe scene to go to, that we're not dealing with an undetonated device or a sympathetic device or a secondary explosion.
Detective James Gamber with the Pima County Sheriff's Department arrives at the scene, the parking lot at the La Paloma. Immediately, it was a scene unlike anything he had ever been to.
The first thing that struck me is the massive amount of energy that happened. I mean, the roof of the car has been peeled off. It's laying behind the car, totally separated from the car, and laying on the ground. All the doors have been blown open, and you can see the deceased in the front seat of the car. We found the windshield of the car in the swimming pool at the bottom of the pool, probably about 200 or 300 yards away. And his hand was actually over the device when it went off. He looked like himself with a lot of thermal damage, a lot of burn damage to the right side of his body, because he was in the driver's seat, the device is in the passenger seat. From the damage, it looks like he just reached over and looked down at it when it detonated.
One of the first moves was for detectives to get to Gary's house to check for other bombs. His house wasn't empty. In fact, it was full of friends and family 5 days before his birthday.
They were planning a surprise birthday party for him at his house. So the way most of his family found out about his death was we come storming into the house for his birthday party, searching for an explosive device.
And they're all there waiting for him?
Yes.
The rumor mill started to swirl with a theory.
When you were on the scene that night, are you thinking this is potentially a mob hit?
I think everybody's first gut reaction was, oh, this looks like a mob hit because it's a car bombing. We don't have car bombings in Tucson.
That set off a deep investigation into Gary's business dealings and financial status. And right off the bat, there were some concerns.
He was driving a borrowed car. His dry cleaning was being done through a friend's account. So when you went through his clothing, the labeling on the clothing was in another person's name because he was dropping it off on Richard Hickey's account. He was living in someone else's house. You know, he was overdue on his monthly dues at the country club. So he was living, from day to day financially.
Ron Lehman knew there was trouble in paradise, too.
Gary was still struggling financially at the end, correct?
Yeah.
Do you know how in debt he was or how many different issues there were with people that he owed money?
So when you have a lifestyle where you're spending tens of thousands of dollars a month on your lifestyle, and then all of a sudden your cash flow gets shut off, that shuts everything down.
For a while, there were a lot of rumors that maybe he was killed over a bad business deal. Did you ever think that?
Yes. Before Gary died, I was probably a year or so before, I was in a deposition with a person who I'm not going to name his name, but this person under oath in the deposition was quite angry at Gary over a business transaction that went bad.
Gary was also heavily involved in gambling.
Gary was primarily made his money in real estate, but what really saved him, to the extent it could save him, was he was instrumental in bringing Indian gaming to the table.
It was clear money could be an issue. It made sense as a motive.
Gary had created this kind of flamboyant bad boy image, and he seemed to kind of revel in people going, oh, and thinking there was some mob relation. But when push came to shove at the end of the investigation, we couldn't show any mob connections. So there were all these hints of, well, people lost money, or the Indian casinos were upset with him. But when you followed those threads to the end, there was just nothing that came back to who wants to kill Gary Triano.
Now detectives were back to square one, but they assumed money had to play a part in his death, and in time, they were right.
Did the case go cold for a while?
It did. After about the first 3 years, it went cold. We followed the money. It turned out that he had an insurance policy that upon his death paid out $2 million. And the policy on its face looked very innocent in that the recipients of the benefit from the policy were his 2 children. But because they were juveniles, the money would go to their parent. In other words, it would go to Pamela Phillips, or who used to be Pamela Triano.
10 years earlier, it was a match made in heaven.
Pam actually was very successful as a commercial real estate agent. She had her own money. She brought it into the marriage. Gary obviously had more.
Pamela Phillips was Gary's second wife. Gary was Pamela's second husband. The two thrived on the social scene, pictured smiling, laughing, and enjoying life at all the Tucson parties, charities, and soirees.
They were a power couple while they were together, that's for sure.
When Ron wasn't practicing law, he was shooting and editing amateur videos, a hobby of his.
Gary asked me to make a video of him and Pam to Stevie Wonder's song, I Just Called to Say I Love You. And I remember going over photographs, and you could just start with New Year's Day and Valentine's Day, and they had a picture of them in some romantic, lovely setting with a toast and a heart, and July 4th, you'd have a picture with the fireworks, Thanksgiving table with the turkey and the rest of the family. That video, if you would have seen it, was just the picture of a couple that everybody would say, wow, what a lucky couple they were.
But just as Gary's rich success wasn't quite what it seemed, neither was their seemingly picture-perfect marriage.
She would have known his financial status, and it was, if you follow his financial decline, at his lowest point financially is when the divorce started.
Their divorce was final. Gary stayed in Tucson. Pam moved to Aspen, Colorado with the couple's 2 kids. And this is where the investigation takes an unexpected turn.
But what really helped us out in the case was Gary Triano dies on November 1st, 1996. We know he has an ex-wife who's living in Aspen, Colorado, who are looking at the immediate surroundings to the death. But we are going to go talk to his ex-wife in Aspen. Before we get to Aspen, Colorado, we get a call from a detective with the Aspen Police Department who says there's something very odd going on with Pam Phillips in that there's a gentleman named Ron Young up here in Aspen who defrauded several people for thousands and thousands of dollars, and Pam is one of these people who was defrauded, but she won't pursue criminal charges, and we find that very odd.
Ron Young, that was a name Detective Gamber would get very familiar with. Turns out Ron Young would head to Yorba Linda, California in a stolen van, the beginning of what would become a cross-country search.
The stolen report leads back to Aspen, Colorado. The Aspen, Colorado detective goes down and looks in the van. What does he find in there but a note that lists people that are closely associated with Gary Triano, a map of Tucson, Arizona, certain pages of Gary Triano's divorce settlement, and a sawed-off shotgun, and a note that says saw-off shotgun.
Well, that's interesting. Detectives ask Pam about Ron Young.
She's taken aback by the question, and she immediately minimizes Ron Young. Oh, he was just someone who did some financial work for me. She doesn't talk about being defrauded. She doesn't talk about losing a significant amount of money.
But Ron wasn't in California anymore. He also wasn't in Aspen.
The problem is we can't find Ron Young.
In an era where TV ruled the world,
I'm John Wolf, and welcome to America's Most Wanted.
Leave it to a popular show to help out.
That Ron Young gets featured on America's Most Wanted. His chiropractor recognizes him, calls America's Most Wanted and says, this guy has an appointment to be in my office Monday morning. So America's Most Wanted does a feature show on Ron Young.
Tonight on
They do the whole murder. They connect all these various dots for everybody. The show airs on Saturday, and I'm actually in the studio while we're airing the show, and I fly back Sunday into Tucson. I land in Tucson, I get off the plane, I turn on my cell phone, and I have a message. They just arrested Ron Young in Fort Lauderdale, Florida. You have a flight out of Tucson at 8 o'clock tonight.
Ron Young had a bad habit of leaving things lying around. And once again, that wouldn't help his case. In Florida, Detective Gamber and authorities find cassette tapes.
We take one of them, we put it in a recorder, we turn it on, and it's Ron Young talking to Pam Phillips.
On the phone?
We don't know. We immediately turn that tape recorder off because we don't want to somehow damage those tapes.
They get them digitized into DVDs, and the full picture of what's been happening becomes crystal clear.
We get the recordings and we start listening to them, and they're talking about the murder. We find Ron Young has kept a spreadsheet of payments that he's getting from someone. These payments come every 2 weeks. And so we do some more digging, and Ron has a bunch of FedEx receipts. And if you look at the FedEx receipts, the FedEx tracking number matches the number that Pam's giving him.
They also were able to interview a taxi driver Ron used to get to the FedEx store in Florida. Ron was the one receiving the money each time.
We can show Pam moving money amongst bank accounts. We can show it going by FedEx to Ron. We can show Ron receiving it because of the spreadsheet where he's maintaining the payments. And then we have actual conversations where they talk about the murder. And he says things like, you got your 2, I want my 4. Well, she got $2 million from the insurance. And if you look at his spreadsheet, he got paid $440,000 or something along those numbers.
Detectives are sure Ron Young was the hitman in the bombing of Gary Triano at ex-wife Pam Phillips' instruction. And they believe Ron looked up how to make a bomb.
1 pound of red dot gunpowder, and it's sold as 1 pound, fits into a 17-inch long, 1.5-inch diameter pipe. So we're going, he's building this off of instructions. And at the time, Ron was one of the guys who was really into the internet.
How did the bomb go off in terms of, was it set on a timer? Was he watching and waiting to hit go?
After the ATF did the reconstruction, we knew how it was, and it has a very impressive sounding name. It's command detonated, which means you push a button to make it go. The device had to be within a half mile to a quarter mile of, we'll call it the trigger, with Ron Young holding the trigger.
So he was nearby.
He's nearby, and we think, based on the blast damage, as you have Gary Triano who gets into his car, there's this blue gym bag sitting in the seat that doesn't belong there. He reaches over to pick it up. Ron Young sees him starting to pick it up. What's his thought? Gary's going to bail out of the car. Push the button now. We believe Ron Young was sitting there watching.
Naturally, the next move would be to arrest Pam and Ron. But as unusual as the bombing was, so was the rest of the case.
Pam's not arrested right away.
Neither is Ron.
So what happens in that time frame?
So what happens is we now have, the investigators think, we have a very, very solid case. And we take it to the Pima County Attorney's Office, and they decline to prosecute.
Why?
Well, the first time they told us that you haven't established a firm connection between the emails, the phone calls, the financial transactions. So that's when I sat down with a forensic accountant and we fleshed this out. We took it back to the county attorney's office and they declined to prosecute.
Again?
Yes, and I wasn't given a reason.
Eventually, the Triano family filed a wrongful death lawsuit that went public. That got things moving, but it also unknowingly made things even more complicated.
We arrest Ron, we bring him back to Tucson. I'm instructed to find Pam. Right before I'm ready to fly to Aspen, we run one more check on Pam and we find out she flew out of the United States about 4 days before the indictment.
The case is now international. And once again, America's Most Wanted brings about another tip, all the way from Europe.
I get a phone call from a young man who says,
And welcome to America's
I happened to be watching America's Most Wanted while I was in Switzerland, and I've seen Pam because I go to school with her daughter who's in college here in Switzerland, and Pam is staying at this hotel, living in this apartment, dating this guy, and driving this car with this license plate, and this is where she has lunch every day. And I'm like, how certain are you? He goes, I've had lunch with her.
Detective Gamber works with the Swiss police, but Switzerland won't extradite Pam back to the U.S. because it's a potential death penalty case. So U.S. officials have to promise to Switzerland authorities it won't be a death penalty case anymore. To Detective Gamber's dismay, the Pima County Attorney's Office publicly announces that.
Before the Swiss police can hit her hotel room, our county attorney's office announces to the world, we've listed the death penalty so she can be extradited from Switzerland. So the Swiss police hit the hotel room that is, not surprisingly, empty.
Pamela Phillips is gone again. Eventually, European officials track her, this time to Vienna, Austria. Officials bust into her hotel. Seemed like Pam was enjoying herself.
And they find her in bed with this male acquaintance, we'll put it that way. And she refuses to admit that she's Pam Phillips. They're holding her passport with her picture in it, and ultimately she agrees that she's Pam Phillips, and she's held on our arrest warrant in Austria.
Gamber was expecting the extradition process to take 3 years. Austrian authorities wanted her out of their country. She was back in Tucson within 6 months. Detective Gamber was waiting at the airport.
So the plane lands, I'm up at the gate, and they let all the other passengers off. So Pam and the marshals are the last ones on the plane, and the marshals are like, okay, let's go, get off the plane. And she goes, if Gamber's in the airport, I'm not getting off the plane. And the marshal looked at her and goes, we didn't ask you a question. So they walk her off the plane and handed her to me right there at the airport.
And what was that initial interaction?
It was very satisfying to have her in our hands, thinking that first we'd lost her twice. It was going to be a 3-year wait on the extradition, and it turned out to be 6 months. We had taken this family on an emotional roller coaster for 14 years. You know, now she's in hand.
Unfortunately, it would be years before the saga was over. Ron's trial was first.
We, the jury, find the defendant, Ronald Kelly Young, guilty of the offense of first-degree murder.
Convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But Pam's trial was put on hold. She was deemed mentally unfit to stand trial.
Let's just put it this way. I was a mess. I was a mess. I was a mess.
Yes, that's Pamela Phillips herself in a 2014 interview with 48 Hours. She would finally face the courtroom that year.
The only person who stood to gain any benefit from Gary Triano's death was Pamela Phillips.
The jury agreed.
To find the defendant, Pamela Ann Phillips, guilty of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder as alleged in count 1 of the indictment.
She, too, was sentenced to life in prison, but she still had a lot to say.
I'm not that person. No, I would never harm anybody.
On the night Gary was killed, she claims it tore her apart.
I was absolutely hysterical. And I'm thinking, oh my God, what am I going to do?
She says Gary had many business enemies and people targeting him. But she says, personally, she was fine financially.
He had life threats. I had life threats. The children had life threats. I was worth, I think, $1.8 million, $2 million in there. Made totally on my own.
Even in 2014, she still acted as though she was part of high society, telling CBS News about her days spent with Donald Trump and Marla Maples, as if those days were still reality.
Marla I love. Marla is like an angel. And Donald, I adore as well. And he is one of the funniest people to be around you can imagine.
And Ron Young? Well, he was just a business manager, she said. No big deal.
I met him at a party next door, the duplex next door to me. Very tall. The guy is like a skyscraper. He was a business manager to people that were at this barbecue. And I could use some help with my business. And so that's kind of what ended up happening.
Pamela Phillips has never admitted to the crime.
It's a complete frame. I'm innocent. I am very, very, very innocent.
After the divorce from Gary, Pam lost a lot of money. She never wanted to give up the ritzy lifestyle. Detective Gamber isn't afraid to call it what it is.
You could use the word that's politically incorrect. She's a gold digger.
For all intents and purposes.
Yes.
An ordeal that lasted nearly 20 years, spanning half the world.
And this was a big story in a small town.
It left Tucson stunned. Ron Lehman couldn't help but feel hurt.
It just was so difficult for weeks and months to get my head around that this actually happened. When somebody passes away in a violent type of public statement, I mean, that was shocking. That was shocking.
Do you feel like you lost out on some years of friendship with Gary?
Oh, yeah. I mean, Gary was a major person in my life.
We know Gary went to play golf that day. We know Gary was bombed when he got in his car to leave. But we don't know why he called Ron Lehman twice before he left the club. Maybe he knew he was being followed. Maybe he thought he could use Ron's help. Maybe he had an intuition something bad was going to happen.
Does it still haunt you that you don't know what he called you about?
No, not really. No. Brianna, I'm not the type of person that kind of chews on things and regrets. I try to stay away from that. It's a good question. It always was. I was always curious. I don't haunt myself with stuff that I can't control.
True Crime Arizona, the podcast, is hosted by me, Brianna Whitney, and produced by Sergio Hernandez. It's a production of Arizona's Family, 3TV, CBS 5, and azfamily.com in Phoenix, Arizona. To watch the video version on your smart TV, download the free AZ Family streaming news app.